Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the northern direction, in the direction of Kyslivka, where the Russians have attacked and stormed Kyslivka, gaining a foothold within the northeastern parts of the village. The village of Kyslivka is an important defensive position of the Ukrainians. It is a dual village of Kyslivka to the north and Ocheretyne to the south. To the south of Ocheretyne, there is a trench system by the Ukrainians holding the northern flank of Berdychi, and to the west of Kyslivka there's a second trench which is located here and the heights west of Kyslivka, allowing the Ukrainians to have defensive positions along the main highway between Svatove and Kupiansk here in this section of the front line. The Russians are here attempting to gain control of both of these villages and the fortifications associated with them, which would clear the way for the Russian troops to move through the highway beyond Stepova, Novokalynove, and Ivanivka to the north of these villages, behind them cutting off their supply lines, gaining control over those as well, before pushing on towards Kupiansk from the east. From this direction, they would have the high grounds throughout the whole area. Unlike Sinkivka to the north, these villages are in a grouping together with a far distance between them and the next Ukrainian position. This means that the areas itself is isolated. They are 4 villages together, which makes them strong and powerful, with a solid supply line in between them, which makes them a very secure position. However, the Russians are very powerful in this section of the front line, and with heavy bombardment and artillery preparations, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold and is now fighting throughout the village in an attempt to gain control of it. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we have a Russian breakthrough north of Avdiivka, where the Russians captured 5.5 square kilometers of territory in the direction of Novokalynove and Keramik, gaining control of the northern outskirts of Novokalynove, pushing through to the central parts and western parts of the village, getting a foothold within Keramik, and gaining control over fortifications to the south of the village. All of these advances gives the Russians a significant advantage in this section of the front line. Attacking the northern parts cuts off the supplies of Keramik and Novokalynove from the northeast, leaving only this connection between Ocheretyne to the northwest and Keramik to the east, with the roads connected here from Keramik down through Novokalynove by the roads and the fortifications to the west towards Ocheretyne. The Russians at the same time launched attacks east of Ocheretyne, gaining control of the fortifications there in a movement towards the Ukrainian fortifications located. This is a very heavily fortified area, as we can see with the mapping, that by the intersection here west of Novokalynove, east of Ocheretyne, to secure a strong fortification and connection between the two. With this, the Ukrainians are with their last supply line, which is very close proximity to the front line, and is under heavy bombardment by the Russians. At the same time, we see here in the northern parts of Novokalynove, the Russians are moving through the eastern parts, pushing the Ukrainians towards that final exit under fire by the Russians as they move towards Ocheretyne. At the same time, fighting is taking place in the direction of Ocheretyne by the fortifications to the west of the village. So heavy fighting is taking place in this whole section of the front line, which spans about 20 square kilometers. The Russian advances in the northern outskirts of Novokalynove has been geolocated with this footage here, which shows that the Russians have gained control over the northern outskirts, and it also leads to the roads here to the north of Novokalynove in the direction of Kalynove itself. So we see that there is movement by the Russians to secure the village itself and potentially move in a northern direction. At the same time, the main focus is in the central parts between Novokalynove and Ocheretyne, as the Russians are attacking from 3 separate directions to gain full advantage of their positions and the advantages they have available to hit the Ukrainian fortifications from all directions. The leaving of one exit for the Ukrainians is a classic strategy from the art of war. Leaving one exit makes the defenders not defend as if it was the last stand, as they have a potential exit means that they are willing to withdraw prior to losing, in possibility and in hope that they can save their lives. While if they were completely cut off, they would fight till the last breath or surrender based on their morale. The Russians do not risk them fighting to the last breath, which would be a very deadly and tough fight. Instead, they are playing the safe route where the Ukrainians withdraw under heavy fighting and fire, making that withdrawal with casualties despite them withdrawing and not fighting. and this gives the Russians the biggest advantage to inflict as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainians while still capturing the territory and avoiding a deadly battle through the loss of any exit. A tiny bit south of this location, the Russians have now gotten full control over Berdychi. It was reported that the battalion fighting in the western outskirts of Berdychi of the Ukrainian armed forces decided to negotiate a surrender rather than fighting to the last breath. This left the Russians to capture an unspecified amount of Ukrainian soldiers, while at the same time they managed to capture the final parts of Berdychi. The Russians here in the section of the front line northwest of Avdiivka has now fully captured the second line of Ukrainian fortifications west of Avdiivka, leading now to the third line of defense, which the Russians have already breached, and the fighting is taking place here to the west of Ocheretyne, in between the villages from the north by Novokalynove, down south through Sokil, Novokalynove, Persha, Umanske, Krasnohorivka, and all the way down to Novokalynove. This is the next line of defense of the Ukrainians, excluding Ocheretyne. The original line of defense would be from Ocheretyne, Novokalynove, Solovyovo, Novopokrovsk, Novokalynove, Bruha, and then down south. But due to the Russian breach of this line, it has moved further back to Novokalynove. The Russian capture of the villages of Solovyovo is confirmed with this geolocated footage, both in the northern and southern western outskirts of the village. At the same time, the capture of Berdychi by the Russians has also been geolocated with this footage here, confirming the Russian advances here to the northwest of Avdiivka. The Russian advances to the north and northwest of Avdiivka now amounts to over 30 square kilometers and is the single most area the Russians have advanced in within this month. Moving further south to the direction of Krasnohorivka, the city, one of the most heavily fortified in Ukraine, is now moving through to the central parts of the city. The Russians have captured this roundabout to the north of the gas station, and the area right next to it. This means fighting is now taking place in the high-rise buildings in the eastern parts of the city. At the same time, with the recent Russian advance to the east of the city, it's likely that the Russians are now looking to gain control over the eastern parts of the city through a pincer maneuver where the Russians are flanking from the north and from the center at the same time to gain control over the residential area in between the two areas, to gain control over the fortified positions and high-rise buildings without fighting through them by capturing the residential area next to it and completely surrounding them. They may leave one supply line open, which would be to hold their positions here in the east and to gain control over the residential area in the center, to leave the northern road empty because it is an open road through a river line, which means that the Ukrainians would be withdrawing from difficult terrain through a heavy Russian fire from both the east and the west, which makes the position very difficult for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian situation in Krasnohorivka is generally very difficult and across the front line really, as we see with the advances throughout this month of April. But in Krasnohorivka it is extremely difficult in the eastern parts despite the heavy fortifications keeping the Ukrainian army safe. It is only a matter of time until the Russians hit the Ukrainian supply lines and makes the situation that much more difficult. At this point, it has become clear that the Ukrainians should withdraw from Krasnohorivka to save as many troops as possible, similar to the situation by Avdiivka. It is only a matter of time before the Russians gain control of the city and align the front line here west of Donetsk with the control of Novokalynove and Krasnohorivka through to Ocheretyne, and in the northern parts gaining control over Krasnohorivka, Umanske, and through to the third line of defense west of the city, all in preparation for further offensive operations in a northern and western direction from the city. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon where I have additional content for paid subscription. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.